In 1960, three legends came together in Cannes. The beauty icon Marilyn Monroe, the ice-cold Alain Delon, and the silently waiting Arthur Miller. That night would mark the end of Hollywood's golden age. The Mediterranean sun blazed down on the Crescent as Alain Delon stepped out of his silver Ferrari. May 18, 1960. The Cannes Film Festival was in full swing, and all eyes were on the 24-year-old French actor who had just delivered the performance of his career in Purple Noon. Delon moved through the crowd with that particular grace that separated movie stars from mere actors. Photographers shouted his name in 3 languages. Women in expensive gowns turned their heads as he passed. But Delon's ice-blue eyes were focused on something else entirely, the unmistakable tension crackling through the festival air. This was not just another Cannes. This was a battlefield where Hollywood's golden age was slowly dying, and everyone could feel it. Inside the Hotel Martinez, the atmosphere was electric with more than just champagne and celebrity gossip. Power was shifting. The old studio system was crumbling, European cinema was rising. And at the center of it all, a very public marriage was falling apart in real time. Arthur Miller sat in the hotel bar, his intellectual face drawn with exhaustion. The greatest American playwright of his generation looked like a man under siege, which, in many ways, he was. For 3 years, he had been married to the most famous woman in the world, and it was slowly destroying them both. Marilyn Monroe was upstairs in their suite, and everyone in the hotel could hear the shouting. "She's having another episode," Miller explained quietly to anyone who asked, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had run out of explanations. The pressure of the festival. The photographers. The questions. She gets overwhelmed. But Delon, observing from across the bar where he nursed a glass of wine, saw something else entirely. He had grown up watching people perform survival, and he recognized the signs. This was not an episode. This was a woman drowning. He had arrived in Cannes with his own burdens. Purple Noon was his breakthrough film, but it had also typecast him as a beautiful psychopath. Critics called him the new face of European cinema, but they questioned whether there was substance behind the perfect features. Tonight's premiere would determine whether he was an actor or just another pretty face with good lighting. But watching Arthur Miller's obvious distress, listening to the shouting that periodically drifted down from the upper floors, Delon found himself thinking about something else entirely. The responsibility that came with being seen as salvation by someone who was drowning. The shouting stopped abruptly. A door slammed. Then footsteps on the marble stairs, quick, desperate footsteps in high heels. Marilyn Monroe appeared in the hotel lobby like a wounded angel. Even in distress, even with tears streaking her makeup, she was luminous. The kind of beautiful that stopped time and made everyone else in the room fade to background noise. But Delon did not see the icon. He saw the woman underneath, fragile, terrified, looking around the lobby like a trapped animal searching for an exit. Their eyes met across the crowded room. Hers wide with panic and something that might have been hope, his steady, assessing, completely without judgment. Miller was on his feet immediately, moving toward her with the controlled urgency of a man accustomed to managing crises. "Marilyn, darling, please. Come back upstairs. We can talk about this privately." But Monroe did not move toward her husband. She moved toward the stranger with the ice-blue eyes who was watching her with something she had not seen from a man in years. Genuine concern without desire. "Excuse me," she said to Delon, her famous breathy voice shaking slightly. "You're Alain Delon, aren't you? The actor from the French film?" Delon nodded, setting down his wineglass. "I am. I need—" She glanced back at Miller, who was approaching with barely controlled anger in his eyes. "I need to speak with someone who understands." "Understands what?" Monroe looked directly into his eyes, and Delon saw something there that would haunt him for decades. A desperation so complete that it bordered on madness. What it feels like to be trapped, but Delon didn't yet know how desperate Monroe was. The lobby of the Hotel Martinez seemed to freeze around them. Marilyn Monroe stood 3 feet from Alain Delon, her famous curves trembling beneath a white cocktail dress that probably cost more than most people made in a year. But it was not her beauty that struck Delon in that moment. It was her complete and utter vulnerability. Arthur Miller reached them before Delon could respond to her plea about feeling trapped. The playwright's hand closed around his wife's elbow with the practiced grip of a man who had done this many times before. "Marilyn, you are making a scene," Miller said quietly, his voice carrying the controlled patience of someone addressing a difficult child. "People are staring. Let them stare, Monroe replied, but she did not pull away from his grip. Even in rebellion, she seemed incapable of complete defiance. Delon watched this exchange with the cold, analytical mind that had served him well in his climb from foster homes to stardom. He recognized the dynamic immediately: controller and controlled. The intelligent man who believed he knew what was best for everyone around him, and the beautiful woman who had been convinced she was incapable of making her own decisions. Perhaps, Delon said carefully, we could all sit down and discuss this like civilized people. Miller's eyes snapped to him with laser focus. I do not believe we have been introduced, Monsieur Delon. I am Arthur Miller. This is my wife, Marilyn. The emphasis on my wife was subtle but unmistakable. A territorial claim disguised as politeness. Of course. I have great admiration for your work, Delon replied, though his eyes remained on Monroe. Death of a Salesman was brilliant. Thank you. Miller's grip on Monroe's arm tightened slightly. Marilyn was just feeling overwhelmed by the festival atmosphere. We were heading back to our room. Were we? Monroe asked, and there was something in her voice that made Delon look at her more closely. Beneath the famous breathiness, beneath the vulnerable trembling, there was steel. Damaged steel, perhaps, but steel nonetheless. Yes, darling, you need rest. The premiere is tomorrow night, and you know how you get when you are tired. Delon had spent his entire life reading people. It was how orphans survived, how actors worked, how beautiful men avoided being dismissed as empty vessels. And what he read in this moment was a woman who was not mentally unstable, despite what her husband seemed to believe. She was desperate. What premiere? Delon asked. The Misfits, Monroe answered before Miller could speak. John Huston is showing it here before the American release. It is... She paused, searching for words. It is probably my last film. Why your last? Miller answered for her again. Marilyn has decided to take a break from acting, to focus on her health, her stability, but Monroe was shaking her head. I have not decided anything. Arthur has decided. Arthur decides everything now. What I eat, when I sleep, which pills I take, how many interviews I give, whether I work. The admission hung in the air like smoke from an expensive cigarette. Too honest for public consumption. Too raw for the elegant hotel lobby where European aristocrats sipped champagne and discussed art. Marilyn, Miller said sharply. You are being dramatic, am I? She looked at Delon with those famous blue eyes, and he saw something there that reminded him uncomfortably of his own childhood. The look of someone who had been told so many times that their perception of reality was wrong that they had begun to doubt their own sanity. Monsieur Delon, Miller said, his voice taking on the tone he probably used with difficult students back when he was teaching. My wife is under a great deal of stress. The festival, the crowds, the constant attention, it can be overwhelming for someone with her sensitivity. Sensitivity. The word was chosen carefully. It suggested mental fragility without saying it outright. It painted Monroe as a delicate flower who needed protection from the harsh realities of the world. But Delon had worked with delicate flowers, had dated them, acted opposite them, watched them navigate the brutal machinery of the entertainment industry. Marilyn Monroe was not a delicate flower. She was a woman who had survived an industry that destroyed most people who entered it, who had built herself into the most famous actress in the world, despite having no family connections, no formal training, no advantages except determination and an indefinable quality that made cameras love her. Delicate flowers did not survive what Marilyn Monroe had survived. Perhaps, Delon said slowly, we could step outside onto the terrace. The sea air might be refreshing. Miller's eyes narrowed. I think it would be better if Marilyn and I returned to our room. I would like some air, Monroe said quietly. It was the first time she had expressed a preference since Miller had appeared. The first time she had stated what she wanted rather than accepting what others thought was best for her. Miller's jaw tightened. Marilyn off. Now? Now I think he likes me better broken. It makes him feel necessary. January 9th. The words hit Alain Delon like a physical blow. Not because they were shocking, he had suspected something like this from the moment he saw Arthur Miller's possessive grip on his wife's arm. But because they reminded him of something he had spent years trying to forget. His own mother, beautiful and broken, clinging to men who promised to save her but ended up destroying her instead. The parade of fathers who had controlled every aspect of her life until she disappeared entirely, leaving 12-year-old Alain in the care of strangers who saw him as a burden rather than a child. You think your husband prefers you damaged, Delon said quietly. Monroe nodded, her knuckles still white against the terrace railing. Damaged women are easier to manage. They are grateful. They do not ask difficult questions or make inconvenient demands. What would you demand if you were not damaged? The question seemed to surprise her. She turned from the Mediterranean vista to study his face, as if trying to determine whether he was mocking her or genuinely curious. I would demand to make my own choices, she said finally, about my career, about my body, about where I live and what I eat and which pills I take. Her voice was gaining strength now, losing some of that famous breathiness. I would demand to be treated like a woman instead of a beautiful child who cannot be trusted with sharp objects. Behind them, Arthur Miller cleared his throat. 5 minutes are up, Marilyn, but Monroe did not move. For the first time since Delon had been watching her, she seemed rooted to the spot by something stronger than fear. I have been thinking about leaving, she said, so quietly that Delon had to lean closer to hear her. Not just Arthur. All of it. Hollywood. America. Starting over somewhere nobody knows who Marilyn Monroe is supposed to be. Where would you go? Paris, perhaps. I have always loved French films, French culture. The way European men look at women like we have minds as well as bodies. Delon felt something cold settle in his stomach. He recognized this conversation. Had lived through versions of it with other beautiful, broken women who thought geographical escape could solve problems that lived inside their own heads. Running away does not work, he said. Monroe's head snapped toward him, her famous eyes flashing with something that might have been anger. What do you mean? I mean you cannot escape yourself, no matter how far you travel. The woman who gets on the plane in Los Angeles is the same woman who gets off the plane in Paris. Same fears, same doubts, same patterns. You do not understand. I understand perfectly. Delon's voice was still quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. I understand what it feels like to be controlled by people who claim to love you. I understand the temptation to believe that someone else can fix what is broken inside you. And I understand the fantasy that running away will solve everything. Monroe was staring at him now with complete attention. Even Miller, approaching from behind them with growing impatience, seemed to fade into background noise. But I also understand, Delon continued, that the only person who can save Marilyn Monroe is Marilyn Monroe. Not Arthur Miller. Not some French intellectual you might meet in a Paris cafe. Not me. You. That is easy for you to say, Monroe replied, but her voice lacked conviction. You are a man. You are young. You are successful on your own terms. You have never been told that your opinions do not matter, that your instincts cannot be trusted, that your very survival depends on making other people happy. Delon turned to face her fully now, his ice blue eyes holding hers with laser intensity. You are wrong, he said. I have been told all of those things. By foster families who saw me as a paycheck. By directors who wanted to use my face but not my brain. By critics who assumed beautiful men could not possibly have talent. The difference is not that I am a man. The difference is that I decided they were wrong. Miller had reached them now, his patience finally exhausted. Marilyn, we are leaving now. But something had shifted in Monroe during their conversation. Her posture was straighter. Her grip on the railing had relaxed. When she looked at her husband, there was something in her eyes that had not been there before. I will be up in a moment, Arthur. Monsieur Delon and I are not finished talking. It was the first time since Delon had been watching her that she had directly contradicted her husband. The first time she had stated her own preference and stood by it. Miller's face went through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, anger, calculation. Finally, he settled on disappointed concern. Very well, he said, but do not be long. You know how you get when you are overtired. After he left, Monroe and Delon stood in silence for several minutes. The sun had finished setting, and the lights of Cannes were beginning to twinkle along the coastline. You said I could save myself, Monroe said eventually. How? By making one choice at a time. Small choices at first. What to eat for breakfast. Which dress to wear. Whether to take a sleeping pill or try to sleep naturally. Delon paused. Then bigger choices. Which roles to accept. Which interviews to give. Whether to stay married to a man who thinks you are too fragile to make your own decisions. Monroe was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was stronger than he had heard it all evening. He will destroy you for saying these things to me. Arthur is a very powerful man. He has connections, influence. He could make sure you never work in Hollywood. Delon smiled. The first genuine smile he had shown since their conversation began. Then it is fortunate that I have no interest in working in Hollywood. Little did anyone know that Delon had a similar story in his past. What Alain Delon did not tell Marilyn Monroe, what he could not tell her because the wounds were still too fresh too raw, was that he had watched his own mother destroy herself in exactly the same way she was being destroyed. Edith Boulogne had been beautiful once. Not movie star beautiful like Monroe, but beautiful enough to attract men who promised salvation and delivered imprisonment instead. Delon remembered her from his earliest childhood, laughing, vibrant, full of dreams about the life she was going to build for herself and her son. Then came the men who wanted to save her. First Henry, the factory foreman who promised stability but demanded she give up her job, her friends, her independence. Then Marcel, the insurance salesman who insisted she needed to be protected from her own poor judgment. Finally Claude, the shopkeeper who convinced her that her son was too much responsibility for a woman with her fragile constitution. Each man had taken a piece of her. Each rescue had been another cage. By the time 12-year-old Alain was placed in foster care, Edith Boulogne had disappeared so completely into other people's expectations that even her own son could not find her anymore. Standing on the terrace with Monroe, watching her struggle against the same invisible chains that had destroyed his mother, Delon felt something crack open in his chest that he had spent years keeping sealed. "There is something I need to tell you," he said quietly. Monroe looked at him with those famous blue eyes, still wide with the vulnerability that men mistook for an invitation to take control. "When I was a child, I watched someone very much like you allow herself to be saved to death." "What do you mean?" Delon leaned against the terrace railing, his gaze fixed on the dark Mediterranean. The words came slowly, painfully, like drawing poison from a wound. "My mother was beautiful. Not famous, just luminous. The kind of woman who made men believe they had discovered something precious that needed protection." He paused. She believed them. Each time, she believed the next man would be different, would save her without destroying her. Monroe was completely still now, sensing that she was hearing something Delon rarely shared with anyone. "What happened to her?" "She disappeared," Delon said simply. "Not all at once, piece by piece. Each man who promised to rescue her took something away instead. Her job, her friends, her hobbies, her opinions, her connection to me, until there was nothing left of the woman she had been." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sound of waves against the harbor walls. "How old were you when she disappeared?" 12. "Old enough to understand that she had chosen them over me. Old enough to blame her for being weak." Delon's voice was flat now, clinical. "It took me years to understand that she was not weak. She was drowning. And drowning people will grab onto anything that floats, even if it drags them deeper." Monroe's hand moved almost imperceptibly closer to his on the railing. Not touching, but close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her skin. "Is that what you think I am doing? Drowning? I think you are one of the strongest women I have ever met," Delon replied, turning to face her directly. "You have survived things that would have destroyed most people. Built a career that spans continents. Become an icon that will outlast all of us." He paused. "But I also think you have been told so many times that you are fragile that you have started to believe it." Arthur says, "What serves Arthur?" Delon interrupted, more sharply than he intended. "Just like every man who promised to save my mother said what served them." From inside the hotel came the sound of piano music, laughter, the gentle clink of expensive glassware. The festival was continuing around them, oblivious to the drama playing out on this terrace. "There is something else," Monroe said quietly. "Something I have not told anyone." Delon waited. "I am pregnant." The words hit him like a physical blow. Not because pregnancy itself was shocking, but because of what it meant in the context of everything else she had told him. "Does Arthur know?" "Yes." Her voice was barely a whisper now. "He is pleased. He says a baby will give me something real to focus on. Something that will make me want to be stable. And what do you say?" Monroe was quiet for so long that Delon wondered if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a pain so deep it seemed to come from her bones. "I say that bringing a child into what my life has become, would be the cruelest thing I could do. To the child and to myself." Delon understood immediately. A baby would be the final chain, the ultimate reason why she could never leave, never choose herself, never become the woman she was capable of being. Arthur Miller, consciously or not, was using her own maternal instincts to complete her imprisonment. "What are you going to do?" "I do not know." She looked at him with desperate eyes. "That is why I approached you tonight. Why I asked if you understood what it felt like to be trapped. I hoped, maybe someone from outside this world could see a solution that I cannot see." Before Delon could respond, the terrace doors opened and Arthur Miller stepped outside. His intellectual face was set in lines of controlled displeasure. "Marilyn, you have been out here for 20 minutes. People are starting to ask questions." But Monroe did not move immediately this time. She looked at Delon with something that might have been hope or might have been desperation. "Will you think about what I told you?" she asked. "Will you help me find the way?" Delon felt the weight of her need pressing down on him like a physical force. The same need he had seen in his mother's eyes. The same desperate belief that someone else could provide salvation. And he realized with crystal clarity that this was the moment when he would either repeat the pattern that had destroyed his mother or break it forever. But the truly shocking thing had yet to happen. The decision that would define both their legacies came to Alain Delon in a moment of perfect clarity. Standing on that Cannes terrace with Marilyn Monroe's desperate eyes searching his face for salvation, he realized he had reached the same crossroads that had destroyed his mother. The choice between enabling someone as dependents or forcing them to find their own strength. Arthur Miller was approaching with the measured steps of a man accustomed to managing crises. Monroe was waiting for Delon's answer like a drowning woman waiting for a life preserver. And Delon understood, with the cold analytical mind that had carried him from foster homes to stardom, that whatever he said next would echo through decades. "Marilyn," he said quietly, "I cannot save you." The words hit her like a slap. Her famous blue eyes widened with hurt, then narrowed with something that might have been anger, or might have been betrayal. "But you said you understood." "I understand perfectly. That is why I cannot save you." Delon's voice was gentle but implacable. "Every man who has tried to save you has made you smaller. I will not be another cage disguised as rescue." Miller had reached them now, his intellectual face showing carefully controlled relief. He had heard enough of Delon's words to understand that the French actor was not going to be the knight in shining armor his wife was seeking. "Wise words, Monsieur Delon," Miller said. "Marilyn has a tendency to romanticize the idea of running away from her responsibilities." But Delon was not finished. He turned to face Miller directly, those ice-blue eyes carrying a coldness that made the playwright take an involuntary step backward. "I will not save her," Delon said. "But neither will I stand by and watch her be destroyed by someone who claims to love her." The air on the terrace suddenly felt electric with tension. Miller's carefully maintained composure cracked slightly. "I beg your pardon? Your wife is not mentally ill, Monsieur Miller. She is suffocated." "There is a difference." Delon's voice was quiet but carried absolute conviction. "And a man of your intelligence knows the difference." "You have known my wife for 30 minutes, Miller replied, his voice rising slightly. "I have been married to her for 3 years. I think I understand her condition better than—" "You understand her dependence," Delon interrupted. "Because you created it. Methodically. Systematically. The same way other men created my mother's dependence until there was nothing left of the woman she had been." Monroe was staring at both men now, as if seeing them clearly for the first time. The dynamic that had been invisible to her for 3 years was suddenly, starkly illuminated. "Marilyn," Miller said, reaching for her arm with practiced authority, "this man is filling your head with nonsense. You need stability, not romantic fantasies about independence." But Monroe stepped away from his reaching hand. A small movement, but the first time Delon had seen her physically reject her husband's control. "What if he is right?" she said quietly. "He is not right. He is a stranger who knows nothing about—" "What if he is right, Arthur?" Monroe's voice was gaining strength now, losing that famous breathiness that had made her seem so fragile. "What if I am not sick? What if I am just tired of being told I am sick?" Miller's face went through several emotions rapidly: surprise, anger, calculation, finally settling on the patronizing patience of a man addressing a child having a tantrum. "Sweetheart, you are having one of your episodes. Tomorrow you will feel differently." "You always do." But Monroe was shaking her head. "No, Arthur. Tomorrow I will feel the same. And the day after that. And the day after that, unless—" She looked at Delon. "Unless I choose to feel differently." Delon nodded slowly. "The choice is always yours." It has always been yours. Other people can make it easier or harder, but they cannot make it for you. Miller's composure finally cracked completely. You arrogant bastard. You think you can walk into my marriage and destroy 3 years of careful work with a few pretty words? I think, Delon replied calmly, that you just revealed exactly what this marriage is. Work, your project. Your attempt to reshape a human being into something more manageable. Get away from my wife. I am not your wife, Monroe said quietly. The words were barely audible, but they seemed to echo across the terrace like thunder. What did you say? I said I am not your wife. Not anymore. Not the way you mean it. Monroe was standing straighter now, her famous curves no longer trembling with vulnerability but solid with newfound resolve. I am a woman who has been married to you. There is a difference. Miller stared at her as if she had sprouted wings. Marilyn, you are being ridiculous. You need me. You need the stability I provide. Without you, I would find out who I really am, Monroe finished. And maybe that terrifies you more than it terrifies me. She turned to Delon one final time. Thank you. For not saving me. For making me remember that I could save myself. Delon nodded. That is all any of us can do, save ourselves. Everything else is just performance. Monroe walked past both men toward the terrace doors, moving with a grace that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with genuine strength finally unleashed. At the doorway, she paused and looked back. Arthur, she said, and her voice carried a finality that made both men understand this was not a temporary rebellion. I will be staying in a different room tonight. And tomorrow I will be making some calls. To my agent, to my lawyer. To the people who work for me, not for us. She disappeared into the hotel, leaving Miller and Delon alone on the terrace. Miller turned to Delon with undisguised hatred. You have destroyed everything. She will not survive without guidance, without structure. You have killed her, but Delon was already walking away. At the terrace doors, he turned back one final time. No, Monsieur Miller, you were killing her. I simply reminded her that she was still breathing. 80 months later, Marilyn Monroe was found dead in her Los Angeles home. The official cause was listed as an overdose of barbiturates. But those who knew the real story understood that she had died of something else entirely. The courage to try to save herself, and the discovery that some prisons are too strong to break free from alone. At her funeral, Delon sent a single white rose with a note that read, "For the woman who remembered she could choose." 50 years later, what Delon said about her. I could not save her. But for one night in Cannes, she remembered that she was worth saving. That was enough. That had to be enough. Is it better to try to save someone or to help them become stronger? Which is the right approach?